Hey everybody, I'm Clay Lehman with Resolute Property Management. Today we're continuing our series for do-it-yourself landlords. This is an area that creates a lot of conflict between tenants and landlords when it's not handled correctly. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the different responsibilities of the landlord versus the responsibilities of the tenant, as well as some best practices to set yourself up for success when entering into a lease as it relates to repairs and maintenance. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, what are your responsibilities as a landlord? So this falls into a number of categories. You have legal responsibilities that should be spelled out very clearly in your lease, as well as legal responsibilities under the state of Florida. But there are other responsibilities that you have as well. You have a responsibility to your tenant to be, a good partner, and you want to keep in mind that as you're handling repair and maintenance requests from the tenant, you want to keep in mind the long-term relationship with that tenant. You want them to renew. The number one reason that tenants don't renew their lease is because of the way repairs and maintenance are handled. Perception of them not being handled fairly and in a timely manner. You also have to keep in mind your responsibility to yourself and to the asset that you own. So that property, while it is in the tenant's possession, it's still your property. And if you're like most of us, when you own a rental property, it's one of the most valuable assets in your portfolio. So you have a responsibility to the upkeep of that property. Later in this video, we'll talk more about the tenant's responsibilities, but the first thing that we're going to talk about is a common mistake that we see landlords make. And that is allowing the tenant to perform repairs. It seems like a great idea, right? Like, they're the ones that are living there, and it's a really simple repair, so I'm just going to let them do it. Well, there are a number of risks involved in that. One of the big things we see landlords doing is saying, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say that the tenant is responsible for all repairs up to $75, $150, name your number. But they think that what that'll do is, hey, I'm going to shift responsibility to the tenant. And there's some logic in that. It's kind of like your copay with your health insurance. You're not really making a significant contribution to the cost, but it keeps in your mind that, oh, I don't want to go, every time I feel ill. Well, the problem is that when you say to the tenant, hey, you're responsible for repairs up to a certain amount, the tenant's not going to make those repairs. So that dripping, the dripping underneath your sink, that's slowly but surely rotting away the cabinetry, or the issue that's occurring with the roof, or there's just so many different issues that the tenant may not report that at the time are inexpensive, but then grow into something much, much more. The other issue is your liability. So if the tenant is out making repairs and is injured, well, guess who's and I'm not saying at fault, but guess who has some shared liability, and that's you as the owner of the home. Now, because you're a responsible landlord, you have liability insurance, but nobody wants to go through the headache of, adjudicating or going to court over some form of issue with the tenant. You also don't know the quality of those repairs. So you have the tenant making repairs, even those that say, hey, I'm a handyman, or maybe that actually are. You don't know what quality of the repairs are. You have less control. And then, as we already discussed, it kind of leads to a bit of neglect. That tenant doesn't necessarily report those things that you might want to repair and get in front of to preserve the condition of your property. Next, let's talk about emergency repairs. One of the most critical things in any relationship, but especially in the landlord-tenant relationship, is expectations. Not everybody thinks the same when it comes to what constitutes an emergency. So as a landlord, to save yourself and your tenant headache and potential friction down the road, it's important to include in your lease a definition of an emergency repair. Now, it can be added as an addendum, or it can simply be, something you provide to them that says, hey, an emergency repair is, because you don't want to get that call in the middle of the night on a non-emergency repair because there's a lack of understanding between you and the tenant. So we were going to touch on really briefly some of the things that constitute an emergency repair. Now, bear in mind there are some legal definitions related to what are required repairs, and this is not meant to substitute for that. So please, take it upon yourself to visit. The Florida legal statutes are out there and available for everyone, but these are some things we run into very commonly. So like major appliances. So if a fridge fails, the tenant has their food is in that fridge, And so that food could be ruined, and then also they wouldn't have the opportunity to keep food on hand. So a refrigerator is typically an emergency repair. AC and heat, especially here in Florida, it's funny, the statutes are more specific about the requirement to provide heat than they are to provide AC. But the fact of the matter is, if you have somebody here in Florida that does not have AC in the heat of the summer, that can be an emergency and lead to real serious issues. So we consider that an emergency repair. Obviously, the loss of electricity would be an emergency repair. There are certain plumbing issues that become an emergency repair. You're required by law to have at least one working bathroom. So if you only have one bathroom and it's not working, then that's considered an emergency. Or if something takes out both bathrooms in a in a two bathroom, that would be considered an emergency repair. Some other things that we run into are like if sewage is backing up into one of the toilets or bathrooms, or that's an emergency clearly, because not only is that obviously very, very, very inconvenient and off-putting for your tenant, but anytime you have water intrusion in your property, it leads to much greater damage. We touched on the non-working toilet. And then one of the issues that we deal with here in Florida, obviously, is hurricanes, but also other windstorms. So anytime that there's a tree limb or a tree that falls on your home, that is considered an emergency repair that needs to be addressed immediately. So it's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but then that's just some things to be prepared for when you're sitting down to talk to your tenant about what's an emergency, and as you're preparing yourself for managing your home. Now, the landlord is not responsible for damages caused by the tenant. And so that's the legal matter. You're not responsible for damages. Typically, your lease is going to state that you're providing the tenant with the home and that they're responsible for bringing it back to you in the same condition. But the practical matter is, again, this is one of your most valuable assets. So while you're not responsible for damages caused by the tenant, you'll want to kind of control the repairs that are going to be done by the tenant. So if they bring to you that something's been damaged, then you'll want to make arrangements for the tenant to pay for it, but you'll want to control who's making the repairs and signing off on how those repairs are made and that you're satisfied with those repairs. Next, we're going to talk about what are the tenant's responsibilities, because the tenant does have responsibilities under the lease. And again, it's so very important to spell out very carefully what you expect and what you don't expect the tenant to be responsible for. The more clear you can be about that up front, the less opportunity for misinterpretation will exist. Some of the things that they're responsible for is keeping the home neat and clean. This isn't just because it needs to look nice, but when you keep the home a mess with things piled in corners and food, then you start to have a pest problem. Generally speaking, the tenant's going to be responsible for light bulbs. One of the things I will point out is if you have very high ceilings, I would recommend that you let the tenant know that when those light bulbs are out, that you'll make the change. Anytime you have a tenant on a ladder is a mistake. That is a potential for liability. So I would just let them know, hey, if those go out, let me know and we'll get somebody to change them. Air filters, same thing here. Generally speaking, a tenant should be capable of changing their air filters. It's a great idea, in my opinion, and a very inexpensive step to buy the air filters for your tenant. You want to increase the likelihood that they're going to change the air filters because, yes, they are responsible for changing the air filters, but if they don't change those air filters, it can have serious consequences for your AC unit. And while, again, the legal matter is they're responsible for it, the practical matter is that it's very challenging to prove that, hey, this AC had these issues because the air filter wasn't changed. So you can go to Lowe's or Home Depot, take your current filter, find the filter that matches, buy 12 of them, leave them for the tenant, and then show them in their orientation how to change the air filter. Another note, similar to what I said about light bulbs, if your filter is in the attic or in the ceiling or somewhere that's difficult to get to, you're going to want to take responsibility for that. It's in your best interest. They are responsible for damages. Again, we like to define up front what are acceptable wear and tear type damages and then what are non-acceptable wear and tear type damages. So we have a document that we provide to the tenant that defines for them what will accept when they turn the property back over and what they need to fix. And again, I'm not talking about tenant repairs, but just in terms of, like, we don't love it when they, patch holes in the home, because even if we have the paint, it doesn't always match up. So like we define, here's what you need to, have corrected or cleaned. Here is what we're going to take care of. Then in most leases, landscaping and pest control are the tenant's responsibility. I would point out that this is different for multifamily units. And the Florida statutes define that multifamily units, the owner is responsible for pest control. And I don't know the thought process behind this, but I assume it's because pests in one unit can lead to pests in another. But generally speaking, your lease should call for the tenant to be responsible for pest control. The thought process there is that the way the tenant keeps the house will directly impact whether or not they are dealing with pests. Landscaping, that is also something that is generally the tenant's responsibility. The exceptions I would say to this would be if you have a particular, like, oh man, I love this plant and I want it kept a certain way, or my yard looks a certain way and I want it kept that way. If it's critically important to you, you may want to take responsibility for paying for that to be done. And then, if the rental, the market rent will allow, increase the rent to cover that. Because while it's the tenant's responsibility, if it's like a plant that requires special care or like a garden, you can't expect that every tenant's going to be able to keep that up. So it's something to keep in mind. So generally speaking, they're going to be responsible for landscaping. Special exceptions, I would manage that myself. And you want to provide them up front with their move-out guidelines because they are responsible to comply with your move-out guidelines. So I communicate that to them frequently. We give that to them as a part of their lease package when they move in. Then when we reach out to them to discuss whether or not they're renewing, if they indicate that they're not renewing, we immediately provide a copy of the move-out guidelines. We gave it to them already, but we're going to give it to them again. And then in every email follow-up after that, we have it attached because we want to be really clear. The better that we can communicate what our expectations are, the more likely they are to meet them. The more that they meet our expectations, the less expensive our turnover is when that tenant moves out. Now, as with anything in life, communication is critical when it comes to repairs and maintenance. Then, as I mentioned earlier, the number one reason that tenants don't renew is because of the way repairs and maintenance are handled. And I believe that's often because of a lack of communication, not so much a lack of action. What I mean by that is the tenant calls and says, hey, this needs to be repaired. And you say, okay, I'm working on it. Let's say that it takes some time for you to get a hold of the contractor, get it scheduled, get the contractor out there, find out what's going on, do your diligence. Well, if that takes a week or 3 days or whatever, you've got that period of time that the tenant's kind of stewing, saying, well, he said he was going to do something about it, but where is he? What's going on? So it's important that you communicate back to the tenant, here's where I'm at, here's what I'm doing, here's what you can expect, because you just don't want them to fill in the void of communication with their own idea of what you're doing. You want to increase that opportunity for them to renew, to continue paying rent, all those things. Another thing that's important to touch on is you as a landlord are responsible for your repairs, whether or not the tenant is paying rent. I know that hurts sometimes and is frustrating, but if you withhold repairs because they're not paying their rent, that's viewed as retaliatory behavior and is viewed very poorly by the courts. So make sure that if you're in a situation where the tenant's not paying their rent, that you are making the reasonable repairs that are required by the lease. So, to wrap up, what we've talked about today is one of the most critically important parts of the landlord-tenant relationship, and that is the management of maintenance and repairs. It starts with setting expectations. It continues with you living up to your responsibilities, monitoring and holding the tenant responsible for their responsibilities, communicating well, and just overall making sure you're being a good steward of everything, your relationship with the tenant, with, caring for your most valuable or one of your most valuable assets. There's a lot that goes on in repairs and maintenance, which is what makes it so critically important. Again, I'm Clay Lehman with Resolute Property Management. This continues a series of videos that we've produced and are continuing to produce with help for do-it-yourself landlords. If this has been helpful for you, please feel free to comment, but subscribe, and then you'll be included on future videos of this kind. Thank you so much.